The crystal chandeliers of Chasen's restaurant cast golden light across white tablecloths as Al Pacino cut into his steak, trying to enjoy a quiet dinner on a Tuesday evening in March 1983. The legendary Beverly Hills establishment hummed with the kind of subdued conversations that happened when Hollywood's elite gathered to see and be seen. At 43, Al had reached the point in his career where he could eat at the city's most exclusive restaurants without being constantly interrupted, but tonight felt different. Chasen's had been a Hollywood institution since 1936, the kind of place where studio heads made deals over martinis and stars celebrated Oscar wins with champagne. The burgundy leather booths had witnessed more industry secrets than any gossip columnist, and the waiters moved with the practiced discretion of people who'd served everyone from Clark Gable to Elizabeth Taylor. Al sat alone in a corner booth, wearing a simple black jacket and white shirt, reading through a script while he ate. The role was challenging, a detective struggling with corruption and moral compromise, exactly the kind of complex character that drew him to projects. He'd been having dinner at Chasen's for years, finding the quiet atmosphere perfect for script work and the kind of solitary thinking that prepared him for difficult roles. The restaurant was about half full, with the usual mix of industry professionals, wealthy socialites, and tourists hoping to spot celebrities. Al had learned to tune out the ambient noise of clinking glasses and muffled conversations, but something made him look up from his script. Pauline Kael was being seated 3 tables away. At 63, Kael was the most feared film critic in America. Her reviews in The New Yorker could make or break careers, and her sharp wit had elevated film criticism from mere entertainment journalism to serious cultural commentary. She was small in stature but enormous in influence, with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to see through every pretense and affectation that actors tried to hide behind. Al had a complicated relationship with Kael's reviews. She'd praised some of his work, particularly his performance in The Godfather, but she'd also been brutally critical of what she called the excesses of method acting in several recent pieces. Her latest column had dismissed method acting as psychological masturbation masquerading as artistic depth. Kael settled into her booth with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. She was dining with 2 younger people. Probably editors or fellow critics, and Al could see her animated gestures as she spoke. Even from across the room, her voice carried the authority of someone whose opinions shaped how millions of people thought about movies. Al returned to his script, but he found it difficult to concentrate. Something about Kael's presence in the restaurant made him feel exposed, like he was being observed and judged even when she wasn't looking in his direction. He'd read enough of her reviews to know how she thought about actors like him, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. 20 minutes later, as Al was finishing his meal and preparing to leave, he noticed movement in his peripheral vision. Pauline Kael was walking toward his table, wine glass in hand, her expression unreadable but determined. "Mr. Pacino," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who chose words carefully. "I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I couldn't resist the opportunity to speak with you." Al stood, the gesture automatic and polite despite his wariness. "Ms. Kael. Please, join me." She slid into the booth across from him, setting her wine glass down with deliberate care. Up close, Al could see the intelligence in her eyes, the sharpness that had made her the most influential critic of her generation. She was wearing a simple black dress and pearl earrings, understated but elegant. "I've been watching you work for over a decade," she said, her tone conversational but with an edge underneath. "From The Godfather through Scarface, I've seen your evolution as an actor. It's been instructive." Al waited, sensing this wasn't simply a fan approach. Kael's reputation for directness was legendary, and he doubted she'd crossed the restaurant just to offer compliments. "I'm curious about something," she continued, taking a sip of her wine. "This commitment to method acting, this insistence on psychological realism above all else. Do you ever wonder if you're fighting a battle that's already been lost?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Al could sense other diners beginning to notice the conversation, the way attention shifted when famous people gathered in public spaces. He kept his voice low, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "What battle is that?" Kael smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. The battle for relevance. The battle against the reality that method acting, as an approach to film performance, is dying. Has died, actually. We just haven't admitted it yet. Al felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. This was familiar territory. Critics and academics had been declaring the death of method acting for years, usually while the method actors continue to deliver the most compelling performances on screen. You think method acting is dead? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. I think method acting was a response to the artificial studio system of the 1940s and 50s, Kael replied, her voice gaining confidence. It served its purpose. It brought psychological realism to American cinema when we needed it. But now it's become a crutch, a way for actors to justify self-indulgent preparation that has more to do with ego than artistry. The conversation was attracting attention now. Al could see heads turning at nearby tables, people straining to hear what the famous critic and the famous actor were discussing. In a restaurant like Chasen's, such encounters became the stuff of Hollywood legend. Self-indulgent preparation. Al repeated, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. Kael leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm of someone making a point she'd been thinking about for years. The months you spent preparing for Serpico, living with police officers, learning their psychology. Very impressive, very dedicated. But did it make the performance better than what a skilled actor could have achieved through craft and imagination? She gestured with her wine glass, emphasizing her point. Marlon Brando revolutionized screen acting without spending months becoming a longshoreman or a motorcycle gang leader. He did it through intelligence, instinct, and natural charisma. That's artistry. What you do is research. The word stung because they echoed doubts Al had wrestled with throughout his career. Was his intense preparation necessary, or was it a form of artistic insurance policy, a way to guarantee authenticity when natural talent might not be enough? You're saying preparation and research aren't part of artistry? Al asked, his voice remaining calm despite the tension building in his chest. I'm saying that when preparation becomes more important than inspiration, when research replaces instinct, acting stops being art and becomes anthropology, Kael replied. And audiences can sense the difference, even if they can't articulate it. She took another sip of wine, her confidence growing with each word. Look at the new generation of actors. They're moving away from method acting because they understand that film is a collaborative medium, not a personal therapy session. They understand that sometimes the best performance comes from trusting the director, trusting the script, trusting the moment rather than trusting months of psychological preparation. Al could feel eyes watching them from across the restaurant. Several diners had stopped pretending to eat and were openly listening to the conversation. This was the kind of public intellectual debate that Hollywood thrived on, the collision of artistic philosophy and professional practice. The young actors are smarter about this than your generation, Kael continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd watched decades of film history unfold. They know that audiences want to see characters, not actors working through their personal issues in public. Al's hands rested flat on the table, his fingers motionless but his knuckles slightly white. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality that made several nearby conversations pause. You think method acting is about actors working through personal issues? Kael nodded. I think method acting became a way for psychologically damaged people to justify their neuroses as artistic dedication. I think it attracted broken people who confused their personal trauma with creative insight. The silence that followed was electric. Several tables had gone completely quiet now, their occupants realizing they were witnessing something significant. Al looked at Kael for a long moment, his dark eyes processing what she'd just said. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the restaurant like a thunderclap. When Al finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried across the restaurant like a thunderclap. You think I'm psychologically damaged, Pauline? The question hung in the air with surgical precision. Kael's confident expression flickered slightly, perhaps realizing she'd pushed further into personal territory than was wise in such a public setting. "I think method acting attracts people who confuse personal pain with artistic truth," she replied, but her voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments before. Al nodded slowly, as if considering her words seriously. Around them, Chasen's had transformed from an elegant restaurant into an impromptu theater, with dozens of Hollywood's most influential people serving as an unwitting audience for what was about to unfold. "Let me tell you about personal pain," Al said, his voice still quiet but gaining an intensity that made everyone within earshot lean closer. "When I was preparing for Serpico, I spent 6 months riding with undercover cops in New York. Not because I was working through trauma, but because I needed to understand what it felt like to live with the constant possibility of death." Al's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders squaring in a way that suggested the conversation had moved beyond polite disagreement into something more fundamental. "One night, riding with a detective named Jimmy Breslin, not the columnist, a different guy, we got called to a domestic violence situation in the Bronx. 4th floor walk up, no elevator, narrow hallway that smelled like fear and desperation." Kael's wine glass remained untouched on the table as Al continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone accessing deep memory. "When we got to the apartment, there was a man holding his wife at knife point while their 3-year-old daughter hid under the kitchen table. The man was high on something, probably PCP, screaming about betrayal and conspiracy. The woman was bleeding from cuts on her arms. The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even the waiters had stopped moving, sensing that something unprecedented was happening in booth 17. Jimmy tried to talk the man down for 20 minutes, Al continued, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of remembered tension. Calm voice, reasonable words, all the training they teach you about de-escalation. But sometimes people are too far gone for words. Al looked directly at Kael, his dark eyes intense but not hostile. The man started cutting deeper, started threatening the child. That's when Jimmy shot him. Center mass, 1 round, clean kill. The man dropped like a sack of meat, and suddenly the apartment went from chaos to silence so complete you could hear the child crying under the table. Kael's face had gone pale, perhaps realizing that what she'd intended as intellectual debate had become something far more personal and raw. "You want to know about personal pain, Pauline?" Al asked, his voice gaining strength. "Try watching a 3-year-old girl crawl out from under a table, step over her father's body, and ask her mother if daddy is sleeping. Try understanding that a police officer just saved 2 lives and will spend the next 20 years wondering if he could have done something different." Al paused, letting the weight of the story settle over the room like a blanket. "That night, I learned something about Frank Serpico that no script could have taught me. I learned that being an honest cop in a corrupt system isn't just about moral courage. It's about carrying the weight of every decision, every compromise, every moment when you have to choose between what's right and what's safe." The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Kael opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, perhaps recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond her comfort zone. "That's not research, Pauline," Al continued, his voice now carrying the authority of lived experience. "That's not psychological masturbation or artistic therapy. That's an actor doing whatever it takes to understand the truth of another human being's existence." Al leaned forward slightly, his intensity building but remaining completely controlled. "You say method acting is dead? You think preparation is self-indulgent? Let me tell you what's self-indulgent." His voice took on a harder edge, cutting through the restaurant's stunned silence. "Self-indulgent is sitting in a critic's chair, watching other people risk everything to create art, and dismissing their dedication as neurosis. Self-indulgent is reducing months of disciplined preparation to cocktail party psychology because it makes you feel superior to the artists you're supposed to be serving." Kael's face flushed, but she remained silent, perhaps calculating whether to escalate or retreat. "You want to know the difference between craft and research?" Al asked, his voice rising slightly but still controlled. "Craft is what you do when you already understand the character. Research is what you do when you need to become someone completely different from yourself. Al gestured around the restaurant, taking in the expensively dressed diners, the crystal and silver, the atmosphere of privilege and comfort. Look around this room, Pauline. How many people here have ever been afraid for their lives? How many have ever watched someone die violently? How many have ever had to make decisions where the wrong choice means innocent people suffer? The questions hung in the air like accusations. Several diners shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing themselves in AL's description. When I play Frank Serpico or Michael Corleone or Tony Montana, I'm not playing versions of Al Pacino. I'm playing men who've lived experiences I could never imagine without preparation. Men who've been shaped by violence and fear and moral complexity that doesn't exist in my comfortable actor's life. AL's voice gained momentum, carrying the passion that had defined his most memorable performances. You say audiences can sense when preparation replaces inspiration. I say audiences can sense when an actor is lying to them, when they're watching someone pretend to understand experiences they've never bothered to research. Al stood slowly, his movement deliberate and commanding. Every eye in the restaurant followed him as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a $20 bill, placing it on the table. Method acting isn't dead, Pauline. It's just inconvenient for critics who prefer actors they can easily categorize and dismiss. It's threatening to people who think art should be comfortable and safe and predictable. Al looked down at Kael, who remained seated, her wine glass still untouched, her confident demeanor completely shattered. The next time you want to declare an entire artistic approach dead, Al said, his voice now carrying to every corner of the restaurant, maybe spend some time understanding what that approach actually requires. Maybe talk to the actors who risk their sanity and their safety to bring truth to their performances. Maybe learn the difference between dedication and damage. Al turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Kael one final time. And maybe ask yourself why you're so threatened by actors who care enough to suffer for their art. With that, Al walked toward the restaurant's exit, leaving behind a dining room full of industry professionals who had just witnessed something unprecedented. As he moved through the tables, spontaneous applause began to build, first from one table, then another, until the entire restaurant was clapping. Pauline Kael remained seated, staring at the $20 bill Al had left on the table, her face a mixture of shock and something that might have been respect. The story of what happened at Chasen's that night spread through Hollywood faster than wildfire. By the next morning, every major talent agency was buzzing with accounts of Al Pacino's defense of method acting. Radio DJs were discussing it on morning shows. Columnists were calling it the most passionate artistic manifesto since Marlon Brando's early interviews. Within a week, the story had reached New York, where it was retold in theater circles and acting schools. Drama students at Yale and Juilliard were discussing Al's words as if they were scripture. Acting teachers were using the incident as an example of artistic conviction in the face of institutional criticism. The story evolved as it spread, gaining details and emotional weight with each retelling. Some versions had Al reducing Kael to tears. Others had him walking out to a standing ovation from the entire restaurant. But the core remained consistent, a passionate defense of method acting that had silenced one of America's most feared critics. Pauline Kael never wrote another dismissive word about method acting. In her next review of an Al Pacino film, she praised his commitment to psychological truth and his willingness to risk everything for authentic performance. Years later, when journalists asked Al about that night at Chasen's, he would smile and say only, "Sometimes you have to defend what you believe in, even if it's uncomfortable for other people." But for those who were present that evening, who witnessed the confrontation between critic and artist, the memory remained vivid decades later. They had seen something rare, an artist refusing to be diminished by criticism, choosing instead to elevate the conversation about what art could and should demand from its practitioners. The story became legend in Hollywood circles, retold at industry parties and passed down through generations of actors as an example of artistic integrity in action. Long before the internet made everything viral, Al Pacino's passionate defense of method acting had achieved something more lasting. it had become part of the cultural conversation about what it means to be an artist. And it all started with a critic who thought she could dismiss an entire artistic movement over dinner at Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurant. The response went viral before viral existed, proving that some truths are powerful enough to spread on their own, carried by the conviction of those who refuse to compromise their art for anyone's comfort.